I came home early with a migraine and found my aunt cutting the neckline of my dress. When I asked why she had a key, she smiled and said, "I needed access to protect you from yourself." I stayed silent. That was 3 months ago. This morning she was pacing outside my apartment, holding a deadbolt and a folder of medical lies. I discovered my aunt had been breaking into my apartment for months, replacing all my clothes with shapeless sweaters and swapping my makeup for products that made my skin break out. My Aunt Rachel had always been paranoid about men. When I was growing up, she'd quiz every boy who came near me and made me carry pepper spray to school starting in 6th grade. She'd tell me horror stories about what men could do and wouldn't let me go to sleepovers if brothers would be home. My mom tried to balance her out, but Aunt Rachel lived next door and inserted herself into everything. I thought moving 2 hours away after college would give me space, but distance just made her sneakier. She'd call every night asking if I'd checked my locks and whether any men had bothered me that day. When I told her about my breakup with Jack, she drove down immediately and stayed for a week, constantly reminding me that I was better off alone. One evening, I came home early from work with a migraine and found Aunt Rachel in my bedroom with a pair of scissors, cutting the neckline of my dress higher. She had a key she'd copied during her visit after the breakup and had been making my apartment safer for months. She pulled out a notebook and showed me her list. Replace fitted clothes with baggy ones. Swap makeup for expired products. Install extra locks. Cut hair shorter. Remove all wine and romantic movies. When I said I was calling the police, she showed me her phone. She had screenshots of my medical records from the clinic where she worked as an administrator. The records showed treatments for multiple STDs and 3 pregnancy terminations that never happened. She said any employer who ran a medical background check would see them. Any man I dated could request my health history. My parents would be devastated. The records looked completely legitimate because they were in the actual system. My makeup either did nothing or gave me rashes. So I stopped wearing it entirely. She'd installed 3 deadbolts on my door that took forever to unlock. While I slept, she trimmed my hair unevenly, so I had to keep cutting it shorter to fix it. My windows had new locks that barely let them open an inch. Aunt Rachel had set up cameras and motion sensors. If a delivery guy stood at my door too long, she'd call screaming about stranger danger. She'd replaced my birth control with vitamins because she said I didn't need it anyway. She threw out my razors and hair removal cream because smooth skin attracted predators. She even swapped my perfume with bug spray. I found out she'd been adding supplements to my food. My coffee tasted bitter because she'd been mixing in some herb that supposedly decreased libido. My yogurt had grainy texture from protein powder meant to make me gain weight. She'd poked holes in my fruit to inject vitamin concoctions. Every time I tried to fight back, she'd remind me about the medical records. She'd say one request from any insurance company would reveal my history. One background check from a serious boyfriend would show I was damaged goods. She had me trapped in this protective prison with official documents that would follow me forever. I started believing it was manageable until my coworker Emma asked to grab drinks after work. When she saw my apartment with all its locks and my wardrobe of potato sacks, I broke down and told her everything. She was shocked and said this wasn't protection, it was control. She helped me realize how insane my life had become. Emma came with me to change the locks and buy new clothes. For 2 weeks, I kept Aunt Rachel out. She'd stand in the hallway wailing about how men would hurt me without her protection. She left voicemails listing every woman who'd ever been harmed by a man. I ignored them all. I was finally free to be myself again. Aunt Rachel lost it when she couldn't get in. She called my parents saying I was having a breakdown and dating dangerous men. She told my boss I was too traumatized to work with male clients. She called the police saying Emma was drugging me. She even contacted my ex, Jack, warning him to stay away, or she'd accuse him of abuse. Then she got desperate. She bribed my landlord to let her in for a wellness check. I'd come home to find new locks installed, my clothes replaced again, all my makeup thrown out. She'd leave notes saying this was tough love. And if I removed anything, she'd update my medical records with worse diagnoses. She started showing up at my office with homemade lunches in front of my coworkers, loudly asking if any men had bothered me. She told people I had PTSD and needed constant monitoring. But Aunt Rachel made a crucial error while installing a new deadbolt. She left her tablet behind. It was still logged into the clinic system with her administrator access. I could see the entire history of alterations she'd made to my records with timestamps and her user ID on every fake entry. She'd even kept notes about what conditions would seem most believable and damaging. I screenshotted everything and finally had proof of her deception. I knew I had to act fast. Aunt Rachel would realize her tablet was missing soon, and when she did, she'd change all her passwords and probably add even worse things to my records. My hands shook as I transferred every screenshot to multiple cloud accounts and emailed copies to Emma for safekeeping. The next morning, I woke to pounding on my door. Through the peephole, I saw Aunt Rachel's wild eyes darting around the hallway. She clutched a new set of locks in one hand and what looked like medical forms in the other. I stayed silent, watching her pace back and forth, muttering about ungrateful nieces and dangerous men lurking everywhere. She finally left after an hour, but I knew she'd be back. I called in sick to work and spent the day researching my options. The evidence on her tablet was damning, but I needed to be strategic. One wrong move, and she might follow through on her threats before I could stop her. Emma came over that evening with Chinese takeout and her laptop. We spread out all the screenshots and started organizing them chronologically. The earliest entries dated back 3 years, right after I graduated college. She'd started small, just adding a note about anxiety medication I'd never taken. Over time, the false entries became more elaborate and damaging. We discovered something else disturbing in her tablet notes. She'd been researching ways to make me seem mentally unstable. There were links to articles about delusional disorders, paranoid behavior, and how to document someone's deteriorating mental state. She'd even drafted fake therapy session notes claiming I had violent tendencies toward men. My phone buzzed with a text from my mom asking if I was okay. Aunt Rachel had called her crying, saying I'd stolen important medical equipment and was having a psychotic break. I wanted to tell my mom everything, but I needed more time to prepare. I texted back that I was fine and would call her tomorrow. That night, I barely slept. Every noise in the hallway made me jump, expecting Aunt Rachel to somehow break through my locks. Around 3 a.m., I heard scratching sounds at my door. Through the peephole, I saw her on her knees trying to pick the lock with what looked like dental tools. I recorded her on my phone, adding to my growing collection of evidence. The next day at work, I couldn't concentrate. Emma noticed and pulled me aside during lunch. She'd been thinking about our situation and had an idea. Her cousin worked in healthcare and might know how to properly document the unauthorized access to medical records. We needed expert testimony that these changes were made without proper authorization. Aunt Rachel escalated her tactics. She started calling my workplace every hour, asking to speak to me about urgent family medical matters. When the receptionist stopped putting her through, she showed up in person with a wheelchair, loudly telling everyone I had mobility issues from a car accident that never happened. Security had to escort her out when she tried to force me into the chair. She then targeted my neighbors. She knocked on every door in my building, warning them I was dangerous and asking them to report any male visitors. She gave them flyers with my photo and a list of warning signs that I might be in an abusive relationship. Most neighbors ignored her, but a few started giving me suspicious looks. I found out she'd been calling local gyms to cancel memberships I didn't have, telling them I had a heart condition. She'd contacted dating apps to report my profiles as fake, even though I hadn't used any in months. She even called restaurants where I'd made reservations, claiming I had severe food allergies and couldn't eat anything they served. Emma's cousin, Marcus, agreed to look at the screenshots. He confirmed what we suspected. The timestamps and user logs clearly showed unauthorized access and falsification of medical records. He explained this was a serious federal crime, but prosecuting family members was always complicated. He suggested we first try resolving it without involving law enforcement. Aunt Rachel must have sensed I was planning something. Her behavior became more erratic. She started sleeping in her car outside my building, keeping watch for any men who might approach me. She followed me to the grocery store, removing items from my cart she deemed too suggestive: red wine, chocolate, even bananas. Other shoppers stared as she lectured me about purity in the produce section. She created fake social media profiles to message my friends, warning them I was being trafficked and asking if they'd noticed any suspicious bruises. Several friends called me confused and concerned. I had to explain the situation repeatedly, which was exhausting and humiliating. One morning, I found she'd superglued toothpicks into my car's door locks. A note under the windshield wiper said, "Walking was safer anyway, since you can't be abducted as easily." What's really going on with Aunt Rachel's job at this clinic that gives her so much power over medical records? The way she's been slowly changing these files for 3 years makes me wonder if anyone else at her workplace knows what she's capable of. The locksmith who came to fix it said he'd seen controlling behavior before, but this was extreme. He gave me his card and said to call if I needed help documenting anything for a restraining order. Work became my only refuge, but even that was under threat. Aunt Rachel had started calling my biggest clients, telling them I was too traumatized to handle their accounts properly. She'd hint at my medical issues without giving specifics, letting their imaginations fill in the worst. My boss had to field several concerned calls, asking if I was fit to continue working. Emma suggested we needed to act before Aunt Rachel destroyed my career entirely. We spent the weekend creating a comprehensive timeline of her actions, organizing all the evidence, and preparing for confrontation. We decided the best approach was to involve my parents as witnesses. They needed to see the truth about what Rachel had been doing. I called my mom and asked both my parents to come for dinner that Sunday, saying I had something important to discuss. I didn't mention Aunt Rachel, but I could hear the worry in my mom's voice. She probably assumed I was announcing something terrible, given all of Rachel's recent calls about my supposed breakdown. To prepare, I changed my apartment locks one more time and had security cameras installed. I wanted everything documented if Aunt Rachel tried to interfere. Emma helped me restore my apartment to how I wanted it. Colorful clothes back in the closet, makeup organized on the vanity, the extra deadbolts removed. It felt like reclaiming my life piece by piece. Saturday night, Aunt Rachel made her boldest move yet. She convinced my elderly landlord that there was a gas leak in my apartment and he needed to let her in immediately for safety. By the time I got home, she'd ransacked the place. My new clothes were in garbage bags by the door. She'd poured bleach on my makeup to destroy the toxins. The security cameras were covered with tape, but she'd made a crucial mistake in her frenzy. She'd left behind a folder containing printed emails between her and various medical contacts, discussing how to make falsified records look authentic. There were conversations about which diagnoses would be most believable and damaging, which medications would show up in employment substance screenings, and how to backdate entries to avoid suspicion. I sat on my bedroom floor, surrounded by destroyed belongings and new evidence, feeling a strange mix of anger and relief. She'd finally given me everything I needed to expose her completely. Tomorrow's dinner with my parents would change everything. I just had to make it through one more night. Emma stayed over for safety, sleeping on the couch while I barricaded myself in the bedroom. We could hear Aunt Rachel's car idling outside, see her shadow pacing the sidewalk. She'd lost all pretense of normalcy, consumed by her need to control me, but her desperation had made her sloppy, and that would be her downfall. As dawn broke, I looked at the folder of evidence one more time. Medical fraud, breaking and entering, harassment, stalking. She'd committed so many crimes in her twisted mission to protect me. Part of me felt sad for her, living in such paranoid fear. But mostly I felt ready to finally break free from her suffocating grip. Today would be the beginning of my real independence. The morning sun streamed through my bedroom window as I carefully arranged the evidence folders on my dining table. Emma helped me create multiple backup copies of everything, storing them in different locations. We both knew Aunt Rachel would try something before my parents arrived. My prediction proved accurate when I heard commotion in the hallway around noon. Through the peephole, I watched Aunt Rachel arguing with my landlord, waving what appeared to be official-looking documents. She gestured wildly at my door, her face red with frustration. The landlord shook his head repeatedly, pointing at his watch and walking away. Whatever story she'd concocted this time hadn't worked. Emma and I spent the afternoon preparing for every possible scenario. We role-played different conversations, anticipated Aunt Rachel's likely accusations, and organized the evidence in the most compelling order. The tablet screenshots went first, followed by the folder of emails, then the video footage of her trying to break in at 3:00 a.m. Around 4:00, my phone rang incessantly. Aunt Rachel called from different numbers, leaving increasingly frantic voicemails. She claimed I'd stolen confidential patient information, that I was having a mental breakdown, that Emma was part of a trafficking ring. Each message became more unhinged than the last. I saved them all as additional evidence. My parents arrived early, which caught me off guard. Through the window, I saw them parking just as Aunt Rachel's car pulled up behind them. She practically leaped from her vehicle, rushing to intercept them before they reached my building. From 3 floors up, I watched her animated gestures, saw my mother's confused expression, my father's growing concern. Emma squeezed my shoulder reassuringly as we watched the scene unfold below. Aunt Rachel pulled papers from her purse, shoving them at my parents. My mother stepped back, shaking her head. My father held up his hands in a calming gesture. The conversation continued for several minutes before my parents finally walked toward my building, leaving Aunt Rachel standing on the sidewalk. The knock on my door came moments later. I opened it to find my parents looking worried and confused. My mother immediately pulled me into a hug, checking me over as if looking for signs of the mental breakdown Aunt Rachel had described. My father's eyes swept the apartment, taking in the normal furnishings, the lack of chaos Aunt Rachel had promised them they'd find. I invited them in and offered tea, trying to keep my hands steady as I prepared it. Emma introduced herself politely, explaining she was there for moral support. My mother kept glancing between us, clearly trying to reconcile the scene before her with whatever wild tales Aunt Rachel had been spinning. Before I could begin explaining, we heard pounding on the door. Aunt Rachel's voice carried through, demanding to be let in, insisting she needed to protect me from myself. My father moved toward the door, but I stopped him, asking him to wait. I wanted them to hear her behavior for themselves. The pounding intensified. Aunt Rachel began listing all the dangers I faced, the men who would hurt me, the diseases I'd contract without her protection. She claimed Emma had brainwashed me, that I was too naive to see the manipulation. Her rant continued for several minutes, while my parents listened in growing disbelief. When she finally paused, I opened the door slightly, keeping the chain on. Aunt Rachel tried to push past me, but the chain held. She thrust a handful of papers through the gap, claiming they were medical forms that proved I needed supervision. I took them calmly and closed the door again. The papers were psychiatric evaluation forms with my name on them, dated just yesterday. They described symptoms I'd never experienced, medications I'd never taken, therapy sessions that never happened. The forms looked official, complete with letterhead from the clinic where she worked. My parents examined them, their confusion deepening. I led them to the dining table where I'd arranged all the evidence. Starting with the tablet screenshots, I showed them the systematic falsification of my medical records. The timestamps clearly showed Aunt Rachel's user ID making changes after hours. Each entry was more damaging than the last, painting a picture of someone deeply disturbed who'd never actually existed. My mother's face went pale as she read through the fake STD treatments and pregnancy terminations. My father's jaw tightened when he saw the psychiatric diagnoses that had been added just last week. Emma quietly provided context, explaining how these false records could destroy my career, my relationships, my entire future. The folder of emails came next. My parents read through Aunt Rachel's correspondence with her medical contacts, her careful planning of which conditions would seem most believable. She'd researched which diagnoses would show up in background checks, which medications would flag in substance tests, how to make everything look legitimate in the system. Pounding erupted at the door again. This time, Aunt Rachel claimed she'd called the police, that I was holding my parents hostage, that Emma was armed and dangerous. We ignored her, but I could see my parents growing more disturbed with each passing moment. The woman they'd trusted for years was revealing herself as someone entirely different. I showed them the video from 3:00 a.m., Aunt Rachel on her knees with dental tools, trying to break into my apartment. Then came photos of the superglued locks, the destroyed clothes, the bleached makeup. Emma helped explain the pattern of control, how it had escalated over months, how the false medical records were used as blackmail to keep me compliant. My mother started crying when she saw the list Aunt Rachel had made. The methodical plan to control every aspect of my appearance and behavior. My father's hands clenched into fists as he read about the supplements in my food, the birth control replaced with vitamins, the systematic destruction of anything that might make me attractive to men. The pounding at the door stopped abruptly. We heard Aunt Rachel in the hallway talking loudly on her phone. She was calling various family members, telling them I'd been brainwashed by a cult, that my parents were in danger, that someone needed to intervene immediately. Her voice grew more hysterical with each call. My phone began buzzing with texts from cousins, aunts, uncles, all asking what was happening. Aunt Rachel had told them I'd joined a dangerous group, that Emma was the leader, that my parents were being held against their will. Rachel's getting more creative with her lies. From gas leaks to trafficking rings to cult leader Emma, someone should tell her that throwing every wild story at the wall just makes the crazy stick out more. The family group chat exploded with concern and confusion. I showed my parents the saved voicemails from the past weeks. They listened to Aunt Rachel's increasingly unhinged messages, her detailed fantasies about the dangers I faced, her threats about updating my medical records if I didn't comply. My mother had to sit down, overwhelmed by the revelation of her sister's behavior. Emma pulled up her laptop, showing my parents the research she'd done on similar cases. She explained how this type of control often escalated, how the false medical records could have lifelong consequences, how important it was to act quickly before more damage was done. My parents listened intently, their initial skepticism completely gone. We heard sirens approaching and my heart sank. Aunt Rachel had actually called the police. Through the window, we watched two officers exit their vehicle. Aunt Rachel rushed to meet them, gesturing frantically toward my building. Even from this distance, we could see the officers' skeptical expressions as she ranted. Minutes later, a knock came at the door. The officers identified themselves politely, explaining they'd received a call about a possible hostage situation. I invited them in, and they quickly assessed that everyone was safe and there willingly. My parents confirmed they were fine, that they were simply having a family discussion. The officers asked about the nature of the complaint. I showed them some of the evidence, explaining the situation briefly. They exchanged glances when they saw the video of Aunt Rachel trying to break in, the false medical records, the pattern of harassment. One officer mentioned they'd had multiple calls from her over the past weeks, all claiming various emergencies that proved false. After confirming everyone was safe, the officers left, but not before suggesting I might want to consider a restraining order. They gave Aunt Rachel a warning about false reports before departing. Through the window, we watched her argue with them, her gestures becoming increasingly dramatic as they walked away. My father was the first to speak after the officers left. He apologized for not seeing the signs sooner, for dismissing my concerns about Aunt Rachel as simple family friction. My mother struggled to reconcile the sister she thought she knew with the person revealed in the evidence before her. Emma offered to give us privacy, but I asked her to stay. We spent the next hour going through more evidence, painting a complete picture of Aunt Rachel's campaign of control. My parents asked questions, trying to understand how things had gotten so bad. I explained how it had started small, how each boundary violation had been explained away as concern, how the threats had kept me silent. Aunt Rachel returned to pounding on the door, this time claiming she had a medical emergency, that her heart was racing, that she needed help. My mother moved instinctively toward the door, but my father stopped her. We all recognized the manipulation now, the desperate attempt to regain control through false crisis. I called building security, reporting the continued harassment. They arrived within minutes, finding Aunt Rachel slumped against my door, clutching her chest dramatically. When they offered to call an ambulance, she suddenly recovered, insisting she just needed to see her family. They escorted her from the building as she protested loudly. My mother finally broke down completely, sobbing as she apologized for not protecting me better. She admitted she'd always known Aunt Rachel was overprotective, but never imagined it had become so twisted. My father held her, his own eyes wet as he processed how badly they'd failed to see what was happening. Emma quietly made more tea while my family processed everything. She'd become an invaluable support through this ordeal, never judging, always helping me see clearly. My parents thanked her repeatedly for being there for me, when they hadn't been. The guilt in their voices was painful to hear. As evening approached, we discussed next steps. My parents wanted to confront Aunt Rachel immediately, but I needed them to understand the danger. She still had access to the medical system, could still add more false records, could still destroy my life with a few keystrokes. We needed to be strategic, not emotional. My phone rang again. This time it was my boss, apologizing for calling on a Sunday, but concerned about the numerous calls they'd received. Aunt Rachel had contacted several board members claiming I was mentally unstable and shouldn't be trusted with client information. She'd even suggested they do a wellness check at my home. I put the call on speaker so my parents could hear. My boss expressed support, but admitted the board was concerned about the allegations. They needed some kind of assurance that the claims were false. The damage to my professional reputation was already beginning, just as Aunt Rachel had threatened. After ending the call, my father's calm demeanor cracked. He slammed his hand on the table, angry at himself for enabling Aunt Rachel's behavior for so long. My mother revealed that Aunt Rachel had always been paranoid about men since college, when she'd had a bad relationship, but they'd thought she'd grown past it. Emma suggested we needed to act quickly to protect my job. We couldn't wait for a perfect moment. Aunt Rachel was actively destroying my life while we sat here talking. My parents agreed, finally understanding the urgency. We began formulating a plan to expose her actions at the clinic where she worked. The building's main door buzzer rang repeatedly. Aunt Rachel was trying to get other tenants to let her in, claiming various emergencies. We could hear her through the intercom system, telling different stories to different apartments. Most ignored her, but eventually someone buzzed her in, probably just to stop the noise. We heard her in the hallway again, but this time she wasn't alone. She had brought my uncle, her husband, who we could hear, trying to calm her down. He knocked on my door politely, asking if we could all talk like adults. My parents looked at me, letting me decide. I agreed to open the door, but kept the chain on. My uncle looked exhausted. Through the gap, he explained that Aunt Rachel had been spiraling for weeks, that he'd tried to get her help, but she insisted she was fine. He asked if he could come in alone, just to talk. Aunt Rachel protested loudly, but he firmly told her to wait in the hallway. I let my uncle in, watching Aunt Rachel pace the hallway like a caged animal. My uncle saw the evidence laid out on the table and his shoulders sagged. He admitted he'd suspected something was wrong. When Aunt Rachel started spending all her time focused on me, installing tracking apps on her phone to monitor my location, asking obsessive questions about my routines, he began to worry. But every time he brought it up, she lashed out or brushed him off. He'd hoped it was just a phase. Now, standing in my apartment, reading her notes and seeing the screenshots, he looked defeated. I knew she was struggling, he said quietly, but I didn't know it had gone this far. He revealed more disturbing details. Aunt Rachel had been using her work computer to research surveillance equipment, had joined online forums about protecting family members from predators, and had become obsessed with stories of women being harmed. She'd stopped sleeping, staying up all night monitoring the cameras she'd hidden around my building. My uncle pulled out his own phone, showing us text messages she'd sent him over the past few months, detailed plans about how to keep me safe, including suggestions about moving me to a remote location where no men could find me. The messages grew more paranoid and delusional as time went on. He also revealed that Aunt Rachel had been warned at work about accessing records inappropriately. She had looked up medical files of my male coworkers, trying to find dirt on them. She'd researched every man who lived in my building, searching for criminal records or questionable medical histories. Her supervisor had documented several violations, but no serious action had been taken. This information changed everything. With her employer already aware of inappropriate behavior, we had more leverage than we'd realized. My uncle offered to help us properly report her actions, to ensure she faced consequences, but also to help her get the psychiatric care she clearly needed. His support meant everything in that moment. We could hear Aunt Rachel in the hallway talking to herself now. She was listing all the ways men could hurt women, reciting statistics and horror stories in a continuous loop. My uncle's face crumpled as he listened to his wife's breakdown. He admitted he'd been in denial about how bad things had gotten. My parents and uncle stepped into the hallway to talk with Aunt Rachel. I watched through the cracked door as they tried to reason with her. She accused them all of being brainwashed, of not understanding the danger I was in. When they mentioned getting her help, she became more agitated, insisting she was the only sane one left. The confrontation escalated when Aunt Rachel tried to push past them to get to my door. My father had to physically block her while my mother pleaded with her to calm down. My uncle looked devastated as his wife struggled against them, screaming about protecting me from invisible threats. Eventually, they managed to guide Aunt Rachel away from my door. My uncle promised to take her home and get her immediate help. As they left, we could hear her still ranting about the dangers I faced, the predators lurking everywhere, the need to keep me safe at any cost. Her voice faded as the elevator doors closed. My parents returned to my apartment, emotionally drained. We sat in silence for a moment, processing what we'd witnessed. The aunt who'd helped raise me, who'd been part of every family gathering, had completely unraveled. The paranoia that had always simmered beneath the surface had consumed her entirely. Emma began helping us plan the next steps. We needed to report the medical record falsification to the clinic first thing Monday morning. My uncle had promised to support our report, providing documentation of Aunt Rachel's concerning behavior. We also needed to address the damage to my reputation at work and with our extended family. Well, nothing says Sunday family dinner quite like police visits and hallway meltdowns, though credit to my uncle for finally showing up like the exhausted voice of reason nobody ordered, but definitely needed here. As the evening wore on, my parents helped me clean up the apartment, removing all traces of Aunt Rachel's intrusions. We found more hidden cameras, tiny devices tucked into air vents, behind light fixtures, even sewn into throw pillows. The extent of her surveillance was staggering. My father carefully bagged each device as evidence. My mother discovered Aunt Rachel's notebook wedged behind the refrigerator. Inside were detailed logs of my movements, notes about every person I'd interacted with, risk assessments for various activities, even commentary on what I wore each day. She'd been tracking my menstrual cycle, monitoring my food intake, documenting my sleep patterns. The invasion of privacy was total. We ordered takeout for dinner, none of us having the energy to cook. As we ate, my parents shared stories about Aunt Rachel from before I was born, trying to understand when things had started going wrong. They remembered her college boyfriend, the one who'd cheated on her repeatedly and left her broken for years. The paranoia had started then, but they'd believed it was manageable. Emma excused herself after dinner, hugging me tightly before leaving. She promised to be available if I needed anything, if Aunt Rachel tried anything else. My parents thanked her again for being such a good friend. Without her support, I might never have found the strength to fight back against Aunt Rachel's control. As my parents prepared to leave, we made plans for the next day. They would go with me to the clinic to file the formal complaint. My father, a respected businessman in town, hoped his presence would ensure the complaint was taken seriously. My mother would handle damage control with the extended family, explaining the truth about what had been happening. Before they left, both of them apologized again for not seeing the signs sooner. I assured them that Aunt Rachel had been clever in her manipulation, making each step seem like reasonable concern. We'd all been slowly conditioned to accept her behavior as normal. It had taken an outside perspective like Emma's to break the spell. Alone in my apartment, finally, I double-checked all the locks, a habit that would take time to break. The silence felt strange after the chaos of the day. I looked around at my reclaimed space, my clothes hanging properly in the closet, my makeup arranged on the vanity, simple freedoms that Aunt Rachel had tried to steal from me. I pulled out the tablet again, reviewing the evidence one more time. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as we formally reported her actions. There would be investigations, questions, and undoubtedly more attempts by Aunt Rachel to maintain control. But I had support now. People who believed me. Proof of what she'd done. My phone buzzed with a text from my uncle. Aunt Rachel was refusing to accept that she needed help, insisting everyone else was wrong. He was considering having her evaluated at a psychiatric facility, but she was fighting him every step. He promised to keep her away from me while they sorted through her treatment options. I thought about responding, but decided to wait until morning. Tonight, I needed to process everything that had happened. The woman who'd claimed to protect me had become my greatest threat. The family member who'd sworn to keep me safe had systematically tried to destroy my life. Looking at the evidence spread across my table, I felt a mix of sadness and relief. Sadness for the aunt I'd lost to paranoia and control. Relief that her reign of terror was finally ending. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight I could sleep knowing the truth was finally out. I gathered up the papers, organizing them carefully for tomorrow's meeting at the clinic. Each piece of evidence represented a violation of trust, a breach of the love family members should share, but they also represented my freedom, my chance to reclaim the life Aunt Rachel had tried to steal. As I prepared for bed, I noticed something I'd missed before. In Aunt Rachel's notebook, tucked between pages of surveillance logs, was an old photo. It showed her in college, smiling and carefree, surrounded by friends at a picnic. Before the paranoia had taken hold, before she decided the world was too dangerous for the women she loved, before protection became control. I set the photo aside, a reminder that Aunt Rachel hadn't always been this way. Mental illness had twisted her love into something destructive. Tomorrow, we'd begin the process of stopping her harmful actions, while hopefully getting her the help she desperately needed. It wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. The evidence was overwhelming. The support system was in place, and for the first time in months, I felt truly hopeful. Aunt Rachel's control was broken. Her threats were exposed. The false medical records would be corrected. My life could finally return to normal, or better than normal, because I'd learned to stand up for myself. Tomorrow would bring confrontations at the clinic, difficult conversations with extended family, and the complex process of untangling Aunt Rachel's web of lies. But tonight, I could rest knowing I'd won the first battle. The truth was more powerful than her paranoid delusions, and with my parents, my uncle, and Emma supporting me, I knew I could face whatever came next. The morning arrived with a knot in my stomach. I dressed carefully, choosing professional clothes that Aunt Rachel hadn't touched. My parents picked me up at 8 sharp, and we drove to the clinic in tense silence. The folder of evidence sat heavy in my lap. The clinic's parking lot was nearly empty this early. We walked through the main entrance, my father's presence commanding immediate attention from the receptionist. He explained we needed to speak with the director about a serious matter involving an employee. Within minutes, we were ushered into a conference room. The director, a stern woman named Dr. Martinez, listened as I laid out the evidence piece by piece. Her expression shifted from skepticism to alarm as she examined the tablet screenshots showing Aunt Rachel's after-hours access to the system. The timestamps were undeniable. Each falsified entry bore her digital signature. Dr. Martinez called in the head of IT security. He confirmed the access logs matched what we were showing him. The system recorded every keystroke, every file opened, every change made. Aunt Rachel had left a digital trail that couldn't be disputed. He began pulling up additional records on his laptop. My mother handed over the folder of printed emails, where Aunt Rachel had discussed with contacts how to make false diagnoses look believable. Dr. Martinez's face darkened as she read through the deliberate planning, the research into which conditions would be most damaging. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a calculated campaign. The IT specialist discovered more alterations we hadn't even known about. Aunt Rachel had accessed dozens of patient files, though mine had received the most extensive changes. She'd also flagged my name in various interconnected medical databases, ensuring that any background check would immediately surface the false information. The scope was staggering. Dr. Martinez excused herself to make some calls. Through the glass door, we saw her pacing, her gestures increasingly animated. When she returned, she wasn't alone. With her came the clinic's legal counsel and head of human resources. The situation had escalated far beyond a simple employee misconduct case. They asked me to document everything in a formal statement. I wrote for nearly an hour, detailing every incident, every threat, every invasion of privacy. My parents added their own statements, describing what they had witnessed firsthand. The legal counsel took notes, asking for clarification on dates and sequences. The HR representative pulled up Aunt Rachel's employment file and began cross-referencing complaints. There had been prior warnings, concerns raised by staff about her increasingly paranoid behavior, complaints about her overreaching authority and accessing records outside of her assigned cases. She had been spoken to, documented, but never formally reprimanded. No one had imagined it would reach this level of personal vendetta. Dr. Martinez assured me that all false entries would be permanently deleted. The IT department would personally oversee the cleanup, with triple verification to ensure no remnants remained. My file would be flagged and locked from further edits without director-level approval. The legal counsel explained that Aunt Rachel's actions were multiple, serious violations of federal healthcare privacy laws. HIPAA violations that could result in criminal charges and civil suits. The clinic would be launching an internal investigation and cooperating fully with any law enforcement inquiry. They asked whether I intended to press charges. I told them I needed time to consider my options. I wasn't sure what I wanted yet. Justice, yes, but maybe also peace. As we wrapped up, Dr. Martinez apologized for the clinic's failure to protect me. She promised a comprehensive review of their access protocols and an internal audit to identify if any other patients had been affected. They offered to write a formal letter for my employer, clarifying the falsified records and verifying my mental and physical health status had never matched what was entered. Outside, my uncle was waiting by his car. He looked like he hadn't slept. He told us Aunt Rachel had barricaded herself in their bedroom the night before, refusing to come out, convinced that the world was conspiring against her. After hours of pleading, he'd called her doctor, who prescribed sedatives and began arrangements for emergency psychiatric intervention. He handed me a box. Inside were items Aunt Rachel had taken from my apartment over the past year. Jewelry I'd thought lost. Photos she'd deemed too provocative. Even a set of my spare car keys. He'd found them hidden in their garage, alongside notes about my daily routines and lists of people I'd interacted with. He also gave me a letter. Aunt Rachel had written it years ago, but never sent it. In it, she wrote about her fears, of losing me to men, of the world corrupting me, of me being too trusting and ending up hurt. Her words were rambling, laced with paranoia, but underneath the madness was a desperate desire to protect. It was heartbreaking. We drove home in silence. Emma was waiting at my apartment with lunch and open arms. She had taken the day off to support me. We sat around my dining table, the same table we'd once covered in evidence and fear, and now shared sandwiches and a little relief. My boss called to check in. Word had already reached him from the clinic. He reassured me that my position was safe, that the board now understood I was the victim in all this. The clinic's formal letter had made a difference. My reputation was intact. Throughout the afternoon, relatives began calling. My mother had started making quiet calls to extended family members, explaining what had really been happening. The initial shock rippled outward. Most were horrified. A few admitted they had noticed Aunt Rachel becoming increasingly obsessive over the years, but no one had imagined it had gone this far. The family group chat flooded with messages: support, apologies, disbelief. One cousin revealed that Aunt Rachel had once contacted her months ago, asking her to monitor me during a family gathering, report who I spoke to, what I wore, whether any men got too close. She thought it was weird at the time, but brushed it off as just Rachel being Rachel. Now it made her sick. Emma helped me sweep the apartment again, just to be sure. We found 2 more hidden cameras, one in a smoke detector, the other tucked behind a decorative photo frame. My skin crawled at the realization that even my most private moments, eating, dressing, sleeping, had likely been observed. Later that day, my landlord stopped by to apologize. He genuinely believed Aunt Rachel's stories about gas leaks, wellness checks, and emergency interventions. He felt used and deeply regretful. To make it right, he offered to install a full, upgraded lock system, pay for a security company to monitor the entrance, and promised that if Aunt Rachel ever tried to enter again, she'd be permanently banned from the property. His remorse felt sincere. That evening, my uncle called with an update. Aunt Rachel had finally agreed, under pressure from her doctor and a near ultimatum from my uncle, to undergo a full psychiatric evaluation. She'd been admitted to a mental health facility for observation and initial treatment. According to her care team, she was showing signs of both persecutory delusions and a severe anxiety disorder. It was a strange relief. The idea that she might finally receive real help after years of spiraling into this state gave me a fragile thread of peace. The next few days blurred together. I met with a lawyer to explore my legal options. The evidence was overwhelming. I had cause for both criminal charges and civil action, but prosecuting a family member, especially one now officially diagnosed and in treatment, was complicated. I decided to wait. Let her stay in treatment. Let her lose her job, her access, her control. Let that be enough for now. Meanwhile, the clinic's IT department sent me daily updates. Each entry that Aunt Rachel had forged was removed, documented, and flagged. They also discovered she had printed copies of many of the false records and had uploaded some of the documents to external hard drives, though they couldn't tell exactly where she had stored them. That discovery unsettled me more than I let on. I returned to work, trying to reclaim some sense of normalcy. My coworkers welcomed me with compassion. Several who had seen Aunt Rachel's bizarre drop-ins or overheard her voicemails finally understood the bigger picture. A few even shared their own stories of family members whose mental illness had gone unchecked. Emma remained my anchor. We started spending more time together outside of crisis, going for walks, trying new restaurants, laughing again. She helped me remember what it felt like to breathe without fear, to live without being watched. I began to replace what had been taken. I bought new clothes, slowly rebuilt my makeup collection, filled the apartment with things that brought me joy. Each decision felt like a reclamation. Some relatives, unsurprisingly, chose sides. A few felt we had overreacted, that Aunt Rachel was just trying to help. But most stood with me. The facts were undeniable. The extent of her manipulation left no room for debate. My parents struggled with guilt. They began attending a support group for families of loved ones with mental illness. It helped slowly to ease their shame. Their involvement grew deeper, more frequent visits, more open conversations, more care. Our relationship began to shift into something honest and safe. A week into Aunt Rachel's psychiatric stay, my uncle brought me a letter she'd written. Her handwriting was unsteady, the medication clearly affecting her motor control. She still insisted she'd been protecting me, that the world was dangerous, that she meant no harm. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was something. A start. The clinic completed their internal investigation that same week. The final report detailed multiple systemic failures, lax oversight, outdated access protocols, and a culture that allowed someone like Aunt Rachel to operate unchecked for far too long. Several employees were placed under review. The clinic issued a formal apology in writing and implemented sweeping changes. All medical records required multi-level verification before edits. A log of every employee's access would now be reviewed weekly. They also created a new task force focused entirely on patient privacy. Dr. Martinez herself sent me a personal letter. She acknowledged the severity of what I'd endured, apologized for the harm their oversight had caused, and confirmed that every single false record had been erased from both internal and affiliated databases. My name was clean again. But there were still traces left behind. Aunt Rachel had contacted other clinics, pharmacies, and even insurance companies, planting seeds of false diagnoses. Slowly, I began reaching out to each one, requesting access to my file, checking for lingering lies. Some had nothing. A few had suspicious notations that had to be removed manually. It was tedious, exhausting, but necessary. I began seeing a therapist who specialized in privacy trauma and coercive control. The sessions were difficult at first, unpacking how long I'd been living under Rachel's thumb, how many small freedoms I'd given up without even noticing. But slowly, the fog began to clear. I started sleeping through the night. I walked outside without scanning every face. I stopped obsessively checking the locks. And then one afternoon, I caught myself smiling in the mirror, not because I had to fake it, but because I felt something close to peace. That moment stayed with me. Emma and I grew even closer. We went from crisis partners to best friends, hiking on weekends, cooking new recipes, helping each other with work. She never once asked for credit or recognition. She just showed up every step of the way. Without her, I might still be living in that silent prison, afraid to speak up. My parents were more present, too. We had dinners, movie nights, even silly board game battles like we hadn't done since I was a kid. They didn't try to fix everything. They just showed up. That mattered more than anything. Meanwhile, Aunt Rachel remained in treatment. My uncle kept me updated. She was slowly making progress, though her delusions hadn't fully subsided. He said she'd begun to acknowledge in pieces what she had done to me, that she cried during sessions, that she asked about me constantly. I didn't respond to her letters, but I read each one. Some were defensive, others confused. A few were simply lost, like she didn't recognize herself anymore. Her access to all medical systems had been revoked. Her professional license was under review. The clinic reported her violations to the appropriate boards. Her career in healthcare was over. My uncle filed for separation shortly after. He couldn't live with the memories in that house. The garage where he'd found boxes of my belongings, the bedroom filled with spreadsheets and surveillance plans. He put the house on the market and moved into a small apartment near the river. Sometimes he texted me just to check in. I always answered. I kept the folder of evidence in a fireproof safe, just in case. I also kept that old photo of Aunt Rachel in college, laughing, carefree, before fear took over her life. It reminded me that she hadn't always been my enemy, that somewhere, buried beneath all the madness, was a woman who loved too much and trusted too little. 6 months passed. My apartment felt like mine again. No hidden cameras, no voice in my ear telling me what to wear or who to talk to. My life was boring in the best way. Work, groceries, friends, a weekend trip with Emma, where we stayed up late, drinking wine and watching old movies without a single lock being checked. I laughed freely, dated cautiously, trusted slowly. But I lived. And every time I opened a closet full of clothes I chose myself, or got a message from a friend Aunt Rachel had once tried to scare off. I felt like I was reclaiming something sacred. Autonomy, freedom, peace. Aunt Rachel may never fully recover. I don't know if I'll ever truly forgive her, but I do know this. She no longer has power over my life. Her reign ended the day I chose truth over silence, and that choice will always be mine.